Hi, beautiful humans. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 14 of A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn. Chapter 14 is titled, War is the Health of the State. I am running a bit late today, which means that the construction is going to begin in less than an hour. And so I am hoping that we can go through this on turbo mode so that I can beat the drills that are quickly approaching downstairs. So basically, Chapter 14 is going to talk about another war. So, to no surprise, after the Spanish-American War was over, the United States decided to dabble into another war. You might have heard of World War I. You might have heard about all of the things that came with that. But just know that the United States made a lot of money, and that when that happened, a lot of the people within the United States did not want to go to war. We have seen this every single time. But this time, we're going to see new tactics that were used by the government to prevent people from spreading information about opting out of the war. Okay, so the Espionage Act, we're going to see different things and just like different approaches to basically force people to go to war. So yeah, buckle in. It's sad as fuck, but American history, yay. War is the health of the state, the radical writer Randolph Bourne said, in the midst of the First World War. Indeed, as the nations of Europe went to war in 1914, the governments flourished, patriotism bloomed, class struggle was stilled, and young men died in frightful numbers on the battlefields, often for 100 yards of land, a line of trenches. Senator James Wadsworth of New York suggested compulsory military training for all males to avert the danger that these people of ours shall be divided into classes. Rather, we must let our young men know that they owe some responsibility to this country. The supreme fulfillment of that responsibility was taking place in Europe. 10 million were to die on the battlefield. 20 million were to die of hunger and disease related to the war. And no one, since that day, has been able to show that the war brought any gain for humanity that would be worth one human life. The rhetoric of the socialists that it was an imperialist war now seems moderate and hardly arguable. The advanced capitalist countries of Europe were fighting over boundaries, colonies, spheres of influence. They were competing for the Balkans, Africa, the Middle East. For 3 years, the battle lines remained virtually stationary in France. Each side would push forward, then back, then forward again, for a few yards, a few miles, while the corpses piled up. In 1916, the Germans tried to break through at Verdun. The British and French counterattacked along the Seine, I think that's how you pronounce it, moved forward a few miles and lost 600,000 men. Can you wrap your head around this? 600,000 men died for this bullshit war. One day, the 9th Battalion of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry launched an attack with 800 men. 24 hours later, they were left with 84. The same thing was happening on the German side. As Erich Maria Remarque wrote in his great novel, on days when men by the thousands were being blown apart by machine guns and shells, the official dispatches announced all quiet on the Western Front. I'm sure you've heard of this before, that term, all quiet on the Western Front. Basically what was happening is that the press within Germany, within Britain, they were not actually writing about the losses that were happening on the battlefields, because if they did, then no one would volunteer, no one would basically join the military. So they basically would just lie and tell people that everything was great, things were advancing, because if the population really knew how bad things were, they already know that it would be absolute turmoil and people would refuse to join the military. Into this pit of death and deception came the United States in the spring of 1917. Mutinies were beginning to occur in the French army. Soon, out of the 112 divisions, 68 would have mutinies. 629 men would be tried and condemned, 50 shot by firing squads. American troops were badly needed. President Woodrow Wilson had promised that the U.S. would stay neutral in the war. There is such a thing as a nation being too proud to fight. But in April of 1917, the Germans had announced they would have their submarines sink any ship bringing supplies to their enemies, and they had sunk a number of merchant vessels. Wilson now said that he must stand by the right of Americans to travel on merchant ships in the war zone. I cannot consent to any abridgment of the rights of the American citizens in any respect. It was unrealistic to expect that the Germans would treat the United States as neutral in the war when the United States had been shipping great amounts of war materials to Germany's enemies. In early 1915, the British liner was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. She sank in 18 minutes and 1,198 people died, including 124 Americans. The United States claimed that the Lusitania carried an innocent cargo, and therefore the torpedoing was a monstrous German atrocity. Actually, the Lusitania was heavily armed. It carried 1,248 cases of 3-inch shells, 4,927 boxes of cartridges, and 2,000 more cases of small arms ammunition. Her manifests were falsified to hide this fact, and the British and American governments lied about the cargo. In 1914, a serious recession had begun in the U.S., J.P. Morgan later testified. The war opened during a period of hard times. Business throughout the country was depressed, farm prices were deflated, unemployment was serious, the heavy industries were working far below capacity, and bank clearings were off. But by 1915, war orders for the Allies, mostly England, had stimulated the economy, and by April 1917, more than $2 billion worth of goods had been sold to the Allies. America became bound up with the Allies in a fateful union of war and prosperity. It's always about money, y'all. I don't think I have to keep saying that because you can draw that conclusion. It is so obvious. It is so freaking obvious. Prosperity depended much on foreign markets. It was believed by the leaders of the country. In 1897, the private foreign investments of the United States amounted to $700 million. By 1914, they were $3.5 billion. Wilson, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, while a believer in neutrality in the war, also believed that the U.S. needed overseas markets. In May of 1914, he praised the president as one who had opened the doors of all of the weaker countries to an invasion of American capital and American enterprise. Whatever that means. A remarkably perceptive article on the nature of the First World War appeared in May 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly, written by W.E.B. Du Bois. It was titled The African Roots of War. It was a war for empire, of which the struggle between Germany and the Allies over Africa was both symbol and reality. In a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. Africa, Du Bois said, is the land of the 20th century because of the gold and diamonds of South Africa, the cocoa of Angola and Nigeria, the rubber and the ivory of the Congo, and the palm oil of the West Coast. It is important to remember that right now, as we are seeing so much destruction happen on the continent, as we were talking about Congo, as we were talking about Sudan, as we were talking about all of these countries, as we were talking about Haiti even. What is the through line? Resources, resources, resources. This, we're talking about 1915, and these countries were going to war over the continent and those resources. Do we really think that in 2024, the same phenomena is not still occurring? We have to realize what it is, like for what it is, because it genuinely is that clear. Du Bois saw more than that. He was writing several years before Lenin's imperialism, which noted that the possibility of giving the working class of the imperial country a share of the loot. He pointed to the paradox of greater democracy in America alongside increased aristocracy and hatred toward darker races. He explained the paradox by the fact that the white working man has been asked to share the spoil of exploiting, I can't say this, so yeah, basically exploiting Asian people and black people, but using derogatory language that white people have used to describe these two groups. Yes, the average citizen of England, France, Germany, and the United States has had a higher standard of living than before, but whence comes this new wealth? It comes primarily from the darker nations of the world: Asia, Africa, South and Central America, the West Indies, and the islands of the South Seas. Du Bois saw the ingenuity of capitalism in uniting exploiter and exploited, creating a safety valve for explosive class conflict. It is no longer simply the merchant prince or the aristocratic monopoly or even the employing class that is exploiting the world. It is the nation, a new democratic nation, composed of united capital and labor. The U.S. fitted the idea of Du Bois. American capitalism needed international rivalry, a periodic war to create an artificial community of interest between rich and poor, supplanting the genuine community of interest among the poor that showed itself in sporadic movements. How conscious of this were individual entrepreneurs and statesmen? That is hard to know, but their actions, even if half-conscious, instinctive drives to survive, matched such a scheme. And in 1917, this demanded a national consensus for war. The day after Congress declared war, the Socialist Party met an emergency convention in St. Louis and called the declaration a crime against the people of the United States. In the summer of 1917, socialist anti-war meetings in Minnesota drew large crowds, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 farmers protesting the war. A local newspaper in Wisconsin, the Plymouth Review, said that probably no party ever gained more rapidly in strength than the Socialist Party at that present time. It reported that thousands assembled to hear socialist speakers in places where ordinarily a few hundred were considered large assemblages. George Creel and the government were behind the formation of an American Alliance for Labor and Democracy, whose president was Samuel Gompers, and whose aim was to unify sentiment in the nation for the war. There were branches in 164 cities. Many labor leaders went along. According to James Weinstein, however, the alliance did not work. Rank-and-file working-class support for the war remained lukewarm, and although some prominent socialists, Jack London, Upton Sinclair, Clarence Darrow, became pro-war after the U.S. entered, most socialists continued their opposition. Also remember, Samuel Gompers was the president of the conservative union that we were talking about last chapter. So we have to remember that Samuel Gompers was working with the capitalists, really, because although he was representing a labor union, it was a conservative labor union that was trying to unify labor and capital. It was not actually trying to make it so that the people were thriving. So there is no surprise to me that he was for the war and that he was trying to get farmers and people within his union to volunteer to join the military for the war. Congress passed and Wilson signed in June of 1917 the Espionage Act. From its title, one would suppose that it was against spying. However, it had a clause that provided penalties for up to 20 years in prison for whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States. Yes, it became illegal for somebody to speak aloud anything, write about anything that would encourage any single person to not want to sign up for this war, which meant that the socialists that were speaking out against this war were now basically in violation of the law and were facing 20 years of imprisonment. That is insane. That's insane. That's actually insane. Anyone who said anything would go to jail for encouraging people to question whether they wanted to put their bodies on the line for a war that had nothing to do with them, that had nothing to do with their pockets, that had nothing to do with the well-being of their families or of their legacy. When referencing the Espionage Act, unless one had a theory about the nature of governments, it was not clear how the Espionage Act would be used. It even had a clause that said nothing in this section shall be construed to limit or restrict any discussion, comment, or criticism of the acts or policies of government, but his double talk concealed a singleness of purpose. The Espionage Act was used to imprison Americans who spoke or wrote against the war. 2 months after the law was passed, a socialist named Charles Schneck was arrested in Philadelphia for printing and distributing 15,000 leaflets that denounced the draft law and the war. The leaflet recited the 13th Amendment provision against involuntary servitude and said the Conscription Act violated this. Conscription, it said, was a monstrous deed against humanity in the interests of the financiers of Wall Street, and do not submit to intimidation. Schneck was indicted, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 6 months in jail for violating the Espionage Act. It turned out to be one of the shortest sentences given in such cases. Schneck appealed, arguing that the act, by prosecuting speech and writing, violated the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Perhaps free speech could not be tolerated by any reasonable person if it constituted a clear and present danger to life and liberty. After all, free speech must compete with other vital rights. But was not the war itself a clear and present danger? Indeed, more clear and more present and more dangerous to life than any argument against it? Did citizens not have the right to object to war, a right to be a danger to dangerous policies? The Espionage Act, thus approved by the Supreme Court, has remained on the books all these years since World War I. And although it is supposed to apply only in wartime, it has been constantly enforced since 1950 because the United States has legally been in a state of emergency since the Korean War. In 1963, the Kennedy administration pushed a bill that was not able to go through, but it was seeking to punish Americans abroad that were speaking against the war. It was not successful, it didn't go through, but the fact that they even tried to do that is crazy. Like, what? As we know now, Eugene Debs was one of the leaders of the socialist movement. He came before the Supreme Court in June of 1918. The case of Eugene Debs soon came before the Supreme Court. In June of 1918, Debs visited 3 socialists who were in prison for opposing the draft and then spoke across the street from the jail to an audience that he kept enthralled for 2 hours. He was one of the country's great orators and was interrupted again and again by laughter and applause. So because he was speaking about the war in a way that was negative to the interests of the American government, he was arrested for violating the Espionage Act. Debs refused at his trial to take the stand in his defense or to call a witness on his behalf. He denied nothing about what he said, but before the jury began its deliberations, he spoke to them and said, "I have been accused of obstructing the war. I admit it, gentlemen. I abhor war. I would oppose war if I stood alone. I have sympathy with the suffering, struggling people everywhere. It does not make any difference under what flag they were born or where they live." The jury found him guilty of violating the Espionage Act. Debs addressed the judge before sentencing. "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free." The judge denounced those who would strike down the sword from the hand of this nation while she is engaged in defending herself against a foreign brutal power. He sentenced Debs to 10 years in prison. Debs was locked up in the West Virginia State Penitentiary and then in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where he spent 32 months until at the age of 66 he was released by President Harding in 1921. About 900 people went to prison under the Espionage Act. In the summer of 1917, the American Defense Society was formed. The New York Herald reported more than 100 men enrolled yesterday in the American Vigilante Patrol at the offices of the American Defense Society. The patrol was formed to put an end to seditious street oratory. A whole vigilante group. Let that sink in. Okay, so there was a vigilante group that was formed to stop people from speaking on the streets about socialism, about anything that had to do with anything that was not what the government wanted people to say, basically. The Department of Justice sponsored an American Protective League, which by June 1917 had units in 600 cities and towns, a membership of nearly 100,000. The press reported that their members were the leading men in their communities: bankers, railroad men, hotel men. The League claimed to have found 3 million cases of disloyalty. Even if these figures are exaggerated, the very size and scope of the League gives a clue to the amount of disloyalty. The national press cooperated with the government. The New York Times in the summer of 1917 carried an editorial. "It is the duty of every good citizen to communicate to proper authorities any evidence of sedition that comes to his notice." And the Literary Digest asked its leaders to clip and send us any editorial utterances they encounter which seem to them seditious or treasonable. Basically, sedition at this time was anything that the government didn't want people to be saying, anything that was not with what the government was doing. And this is what I think is so fascinating about the United States, because the United States is a democracy, the United States, free speech, this and that. The history of the United States is not such. People who have tried to go against policies and who have tried to speak out against it in hopes of it making a change for the betterment of all were not necessarily given free rein to just do that forever. They could do it for a little while until they started to inspire too many people, at which point they were taken care of by being put in prison, by being killed. It says here, "It is safe to say that never in its history has this country been so thoroughly policed." Why these huge efforts? Well, on August 1st, 1917, the New York Herald reported that in New York, 90 of the first 100 draftees claimed exemption. In Minnesota, headlines of the Minneapolis Journal of August 6 and 7 read, "Draft opposition fast spreading in the state." In Florida, 2 Negro farmhands went into the woods with a shotgun and mutilated themselves to avoid the draft. One blew off 4 fingers of his hand, the other shot off his arm below the elbow. Senator Thomas Hardwick of Georgia said there was an undoubtedly general and widespread opposition on the part of many thousands to the enactment of the draft law. Numerous and largely attended mass meetings held in every part of the state protested against it. Ultimately, over 330,000 men were classified as draft evaders. In Oklahoma, the Socialist Party and the IWW had been active among tenant farmers and sharecroppers who formed a working class union. At a mass meeting of the union, plans were made to destroy a railroad bridge and cut telegraph wires in order to block military enlistments. A march on Washington was planned for draft objectors throughout the country. On July 1st, 1917, radicals organized a parade in Boston against the war with banners. "Is this a popular war? Why conscription? Who stole Panama? Who crushed Haiti? We demand peace." The post office department began taking away the mailing privileges of newspapers and magazines that printed anti-war articles. The Masses, a socialist magazine of politics, literature, and art, was banned from the mails. In the summer of 1917, saying among other things, "For what specific purposes are you shipping our bodies and the bodies of our sons to Europe? For my part, I do not recognize the right of a government to draft me to a war whose purposes I do not believe in." In Los Angeles, a film was shown that dealt with the American Revolution and depicted British atrocities against the colonists. It was called The Spirit of 76. The man who made the film was prosecuted under the Espionage Act because the judge said the film tended to question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. About 65,000 men declared themselves conscientious objectors and asked for non-combatant service. At the army bases where they worked, they were often treated with sadistic brutality. Schools and universities discouraged opposition to the war. At Columbia University, J. McKean Cattle, a psychologist, a longtime critic of the Board of Trustees' control of the university and an opponent of the war, was fired. A week later, in protest, the famous historian Charles Beard resigned from the Columbia faculty, charging the trustees with being reactionary and visionless in politics, narrow and medieval in religion. Okay, y'all, so I think we're going to beat the construction. I believe that we are going to do this. This is the second to last video for Chapter 14. As we know now, the Espionage Act was basically imprisoning all the people, any kind of person that was speaking badly against the draft law, that was writing about it, making songs about it, anything. Anything was going to put you in prison. That man that we talked about in the last video made a movie. Man's put in jail for 10 years for going against the war. Socialist Kate Richards O'Hare, speaking in North Dakota in July of 1917, said it was reported that the women of the United States were nothing more nor less than brood sows to raise children to get into the army and be made into fertilizer. She was arrested, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 5 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. In prison, she continued to fight. When she and fellow prisoners protested the lack of air because the window above the cell block was kept shut, she was pulled out in the corridor by guards for punishment. And as she was dragged out, she flung the book up at the window and broke it, the fresh air streaming in, her fellow prisoners cheering. Emma Goldman and her fellow anarchist and lover, Alexander Berkman, he had already been locked up in Pennsylvania for 14 years. She had served a year on Blackwell's Island, which we already talked about, were sentenced to prison for opposing the draft. She spoke to the jury. "Verily, poor as we are in democracy, how can we give of it to the world? A democracy conceived in the military servitude of the masses, in their economic enslavement, and nurtured in their tears and blood, is not democracy at all. It is despotism, the cumulative result of a chain of abuses which, according to that dangerous document, the Declaration of Independence, the people have the right to overthrow. The war gave the government its opportunity to destroy the IWW, the industrial workers of the world. The IWW newspaper, The Industrial Worker, just before the declaration of war, wrote, 'Capitalists of America, we will fight against you, not for you. Conscription, there is not a power in the world that can make the working class fight if they refuse.' Philip Foner, in his history of the IWW, says the Wobblies were not as active... the construction's beginning. No! Were not as active against the war as the socialists, perhaps because they were fatalistic, saw the war as inevitable, and thought only victory in class struggle, only revolutionary change could end the war. In early September 1917, Department of Justice agents made simultaneous raids on 48 IWW meeting halls across the country, seizing correspondence and literature that would become courtroom evidence. Later that month, 165 IWW leaders were arrested for conspiring to hinder the draft, encourage desertion, and intimidate others in connection with labor disputes. 101 went on trial. It lasted 5 months, the longest criminal trial in American history up until that time. The IWW people used the trial to tell about their activities, their ideas. 61 of them took to the stand, including Big Bill Haywood. Okay, this is the final video for chapter 14. The construction is beginning, but it's slow, so let's go. We got this. Okay. The jury found all of the IWW members guilty. The judge sentenced Haywood and 14 others to 20 years in prison. 33 were given 10 years, the rest shorter sentences. They were fined a total of $2.5 million. The IWW was shattered. Haywood jumped bail and fled to revolutionary Russia, where he remained until his death 10 years later. The war ended in November 1918. 50,000 American soldiers had died, and it did not take long, even in the case of patriots, for bitterness and disillusionment to spread throughout the country. With all wartime jailings, the intimidation, the drive for national unity, when the war was over, the establishment still feared socialism. There seemed to be a need again for twin tactics of control in the face of revolutionary challenge: reform and repression. What happened in Washington last night was the explosion of a bomb in front of the home of Wilson's Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. 6 months after that bomb exploded, Palmer carried out the first of his mass raids on aliens, immigrants who were not citizens. A law passed by Congress near the end of the war provided for the deportation of aliens who opposed organized government or advocated for the destruction of property. On December 21st, 1919, picked up 249 aliens of Russian birth, including Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, put them on a transport and deported them to what had become Soviet Russia. The Constitution gave no right to Congress to deport aliens, but the Supreme Court had said back in 1892, in affirming the right of Congress to exclude Chinese, that as a matter of self-preservation, this was a natural right of the government. In January 1920, 4,000 persons were rounded up all over the country, held in seclusion for long periods of time, brought into secret hearings, and ordered deported. In the spring of 1920, a typesetter and anarchist, Andrea Salcedo, was arrested in New York by FBI agents and held for 8 weeks in the FBI offices on the 14th floor of the Park Row building, not allowed to contact family or friends or lawyers. Then his crushed body was found on the pavement below the building, and the FBI said that he had committed suicide by jumping from the 14th floor window. Two friends of Salcedo, anarchists and working men in the Boston area, having just learned of his death, began carrying guns. They were arrested on a streetcar in Brockton, Massachusetts, and charged with the holdup and murder that had taken place 2 weeks before at a shoe factory. These were Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They went on trial, were found guilty, and spent 7 years in jail while appeals went on, and while all over the country and the world people became involved in their case. The trial record and the surrounding circumstances suggested that Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death because they were anarchists and foreigners. In August 1927, as police broke up marches and picket lines with arrests and beatings and troops surrounded the prison, they were electrocuted. Sacco's last message to his son Dante, in his painfully learned English, was a message to millions of others in the years to come. And with this message, we are going to conclude this chapter, okay? Let me know what y'all think, and yeah, this is going to make the hairs on your arm stand up. So Sacco to his son said, "So, son, instead of crying, be strong, so as to be able to comfort your mother. Take her for a long walk in the quiet country, gathering wild flowers here and there. But remember always, Dante, in the play of happiness, don't you use all for yourself only. Help the persecuted and the victim, because they are your better friends. In the struggle of life, you will find more and love, and you will be loved." And still, even from the cells of the condemned, the message was going out. The class war was still on in that supposedly classless society, the United States. Through the 20s and 30s, it was still on. Thank you for being here. I'm sending y'all love. Let me know what you think. Journal, process this, and think about how this applies to today. I'll check in with you very soon. I have to read chapter 15, but chapter 15 is titled Self-Help in Hard Times.